A deal that could change the Middle East forever is sitting on a table right now. And nobody, not the Americans, not the Iranians, not the mediators flying between capitals, can agree on what's actually written in it. That's not a metaphor. That is literally what is happening today. While you're watching this video, diplomats are fighting over whether a signed agreement contains things the other side says were never discussed. A president walked out of a high-level national security meeting and within minutes started posting on social media about congressional races. Not about Iran, not about nuclear weapons, about House seats. And in Gaza, a ceasefire that was declared months ago is killing people every single day. 3 wars, 3 so-called ceasefires, and a one-page document that one side says solves everything and the other side says solves almost nothing. So what is actually going on? What does this deal say? Who's lying? And what happens if it falls apart? Let's go through it, piece by piece. It started with a signal that felt significant. Trump announced he would be holding a meeting inside the Situation Room, the secure facility beneath the West Wing where presidents go when the stakes are highest. The message was clear. This was serious. This was real. A deal with Iran might finally be within reach. And then, almost immediately, something strange happened. Within a short window of that meeting beginning, Trump appeared on social media. 2 separate posts, back to back. Neither of them mentioned Iran. Neither of them mentioned nuclear weapons or the Strait of Hormuz or enriched uranium. They were endorsements. Political endorsements for candidates running in House races. Now, you can read that one of 2 ways. Either the meeting ended quickly because the deal is done and there's nothing left to discuss, or the meeting ended because talks hit a wall again and Trump moved on. Based on everything that followed, the second explanation looks far more likely. And here's the first thing that should give you pause. We don't even know who was in that room with him. His Secretary of State had spent the morning meeting with the Pakistani foreign minister, Pakistan being one of the key intermediaries trying to broker this agreement. The military commander overseeing U.S. operations in the Middle East was thousands of miles away in Asia with American troops. So exactly who was sitting across from Trump in the Situation Room discussing the terms of a potential peace agreement with Iran remains unclear. That detail matters more than it might seem. Because the terms Trump then laid out publicly, the demands he posted before entering that meeting, those terms tell you exactly why this is so complicated. Iran must agree to never develop a nuclear weapon, not pause its program, not submit to inspections. Never. A permanent, unconditional prohibition. Iran must immediately reopen the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway through which roughly 1/5 of the world's oil supply passes, and remove any underwater mines placed there during the conflict. Whatever enriched uranium Iran currently holds, the United States would physically go in, take it, and destroy it. American hands, American control, gone and critically, Iran would not receive any economic relief. No sanctions lifted, no frozen assets returned, not yet. Now hold those 4 points in your mind. Because the Iranian response to those exact demands came almost immediately, and it contradicts nearly every single one of them. According to Iranian officials, no final agreement has been reached. Any memorandum of understanding, the document both sides are apparently working toward, would include the release of $12 billion in frozen Iranian assets. Not someday, immediately, as part of the deal. On the enriched uranium, Iran's position is that there is no provision for the United States to come in and physically remove it. That's not on the table as far as Tehran is concerned. And on the Strait of Hormuz, Iran says it will continue what it calls security monitoring of ships passing through. That is fundamentally different from what Trump described as unrestricted traffic. So you have 2 parties, 1 agreement, and they are describing 2 completely different documents. This is where most coverage stops and says, talks are complicated, stay tuned. But the reality is more interesting than that because, according to people who have actually been inside these kinds of negotiations, this contradiction is not a sign that talks are failing. It might actually be a sign that they're closer than ever. Here's something that gets lost in the noise of daily news cycles. When 2 governments are genuinely far apart, when a deal is truly dead, they don't contradict each other publicly. They go silent, they stop talking, diplomats stop flying, back channels go cold. What's happening right now is different. Both sides are actively fighting over the narrative. And you only fight over the narrative of a deal when a deal is real enough to be worth fighting over. The Iran project director at the International Crisis Group, an analyst who was personally involved in the negotiations that led to the 2015 Iran nuclear deal, put it this way when asked about the contradictions: take every claim with a truckload of salt. The reality is somewhere in between. but we are closer than ever to finalizing this memorandum of understanding. That's a significant statement from someone with direct experience in exactly these kinds of negotiations. And he gave two concrete reasons for his assessment. First, the mediators. Pakistan is in the lead publicly, but behind the scenes, Turkey, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar have all been working to close the remaining gaps. That's an extraordinary amount of diplomatic weight pushing in the same direction. These countries have their own interests in a resolution, and they've been doing real substantive work, not just issuing statements. Second, the alternative. Both sides have now looked at what happens if this falls apart, and neither of them likes what they see. The analyst described it as a lose-lose dynamic. Neither party comes out of continued conflict in a better position. That reality, the brutal arithmetic of what continued war costs both sides, is one of the most powerful forces pushing toward an agreement. But here's where you need to pump the brakes. Because even if a deal gets signed, the question of what that deal actually achieves is one the experts themselves are openly skeptical about. Let's be precise about what this memorandum of understanding is and what it isn't. It is not a comprehensive nuclear agreement. It is not the kind of detailed, technically verified treaty that took years to negotiate in 2015. It is, as the analyst described it, a one-page superficial agreement. Something that consolidates the ceasefire and reopens the Strait of Hormuz, and not much more. What it would likely contain is a set of headlines. Broad statements of intent without implementation plans. Things like Iran would dispose of its stockpile of highly enriched uranium, but without specifying how, when, through what mechanism, or under whose verification. Iran would accept some restrictions or suspension of uranium enrichment for a period of time, but without specifying how long or what the enforcement looks like. Iran would allow the International Atomic Energy Agency, the UN's nuclear watchdog, back in. But again, without the technical details that would make that meaningful. On sanctions and economic relief, same story. The document would acknowledge the issue without resolving it, which raises an uncomfortable question that cuts to the center of everything. If this is the deal, what has America actually achieved? The answer, according to the analyst, is not much. We would essentially be returning to roughly the same conditions that existed before the military campaign that brought both sides to this point. The Strait of Hormuz reopens. The nuclear issue remains almost entirely unresolved. And the cost of getting back to that baseline, 13 American lives. Depleted munitions stockpiles, tens of billions of dollars. And, by many accounts, reduced American credibility across the world. That is the honest accounting of where things stand, not what either side is saying publicly. Not the victory laps being run on social media, the honest accounting. But while the world is focused on the US-Iran dimension of this story, there are two other fires burning simultaneously. And in some ways, they are more immediately dangerous. 7 months ago, a ceasefire was declared in Gaza. People celebrated. Hostages came home. Aid began moving. Families who had been living in tents started returning to what was left of their homes. And then Israel began bombing again. Not at the intensity of the full-scale war, but regularly enough that calling this a ceasefire requires redefining the word. Airstrikes are nearly a daily occurrence. Israel has been giving advance warnings before some strikes, which allows people to flee, but their homes are destroyed regardless. And Israel is not allowing Gaza to rebuild. The situation on the ground right now is this. Israel controls 60% of Gaza's territory. The entire Palestinian population of more than 2 million people is compressed into the remaining 40%. And Netanyahu has now publicly stated his next directive, move to 70%. He said it in front of troops. He said it proudly. Step by step, first 70. Let's start with that. Hamas called it ethnic cleansing. And Hamas, for all the condemnation it rightly receives, is still there, still armed, still in control of the territory it holds, still refusing to disarm. A senior Hamas commander was buried recently with a Kalashnikov laid on top of his body. The symbolism was not subtle. Meanwhile, 5 children were killed in one Israeli strike that left 28 people dead or wounded in total. The former Israeli hostage negotiator, who has been involved in backchannel talks with American officials, described the state of negotiations as essentially over. Everything that was on the table is off the table. The hope now is to move toward what the people of Gaza actually need: housing, humanitarian aid, infrastructure, schools. But all of that requires Israel to eventually withdraw from the territory it's occupying. And there is no pressure on Israel to do that. None that's visible. What makes this especially dangerous is the political calendar. Israeli elections are expected in October. Netanyahu, by any honest measure, has not achieved his stated war aims in Gaza and Lebanon or against Iran. And historically, leaders facing that kind of political pressure don't pull back. They escalate. They need something to show their base. And the American willingness or unwillingness to restrain that escalation may be the single most important variable in what happens next. And then there is Lebanon. 50 villages or more have been hit by Israeli strikes since the ceasefire there was declared. 50. And the international community has largely responded with silence because everyone is focused on Iran and Gaza and the diplomatic marathon over a one-page document. But Lebanon is supposed to be part of this. Iran has explicitly demanded that any memorandum of understanding with the United States include Lebanon in the ceasefire framework. That's one of Tehran's conditions, which means Lebanon's fate is tied to a deal that hasn't been signed over terms that the two sides can't agree on, mediated by countries juggling their own interests. 3 ceasefires, 3 active conflict zones, and a peace process producing documents that scratch the surface of problems that go decades deep. There is a phrase that keeps appearing in conversations with people who know this region. The most dangerous thing in the Middle East is when the temporary becomes permanent. It applies to everything we've covered today. A temporary ceasefire that becomes a permanent low-grade war. Temporary Israeli occupation of Palestinian territory that becomes, through settlements, through infrastructure, through time, de facto annexation. A temporary diplomatic memorandum that gets celebrated as a historic deal while the underlying problems grow deeper. The former hostage negotiator made a point that cuts to the heart of all of this. There is no managing this conflict indefinitely. It has to be resolved. And it cannot be resolved without a genuine political path for Palestinians, not a path mentioned in a document as a talking point, but a real one. Because without that, the people who recruit for radical movements will always have something to recruit with. And no amount of airstrikes, no amount of ceasefire documents, no amount of frozen and unfrozen assets changes that fundamental reality. So here is where we are today. A deal with Iran may be hours or days away, or it may collapse again like it has before. If it happens, it will be a one-page document that pauses a conflict without resolving what caused it. The Strait of Hormuz may reopen, $12 billion may be unfrozen, and the nuclear question will be handed off to a future negotiation that hasn't started yet. In Gaza, a ceasefire that was supposed to lead to reconstruction and eventually a political solution is instead leading to further territorial seizure, with elections coming that give the current Israeli government every political incentive to push harder, not softer. In Lebanon, a ceasefire exists on paper while villages burn. And in Washington, the most powerful government on earth is sending signals that are being read completely differently by every party in the region. The open question at the center of all of this is the same one it has always been. Not the nuclear file, not the Strait of Hormuz, not even the question of Palestinian statehood, as critical as that is. The question is this: does anyone with the power to end these conflicts actually want to end them, or do they need them to continue? That question doesn't have an easy answer, but it's the one worth sitting with. If this gave you something to think about, share it with someone who needs to hear it. We'll keep following this as it develops.